September 3rd, 1939. Britain declares war on Nazi Germany at 11 o'clock in the morning, and within hours the Dominions start making their own decisions. Australia, New Zealand, then South Africa on September 6th after a bitter parliamentary vote, 80 to 67. So close that Prime Minister Hertzog resigned when he lost. India's viceroy declared war that same day Britain did, though he didn't bother consulting Indian political leaders first. And then there was Canada. Canada waited, on purpose. Prime Minister Mackenzie King recalled Parliament specifically to debate the question, to vote on it, to make absolutely clear that Canada was entering this war as a sovereign nation making a sovereign choice, not as some colonial appendage being dragged along by imperial edict. The vote happened on September 10th, 1939, a full week after Britain. King George VI signed the Canadian Declaration that same day, acting on the advice of his Canadian ministers, not his British ones. So here's the thing. Britain was never fighting alone, not for a single day. And if you've heard that myth before, in documentaries, in textbooks, in speeches, this is the video that finally gets it right. The Britain stood alone narrative isn't just lazy. It's an insult to millions of people across multiple continents who voted, debated, and chose to stand against fascism. It erases the young men from Saskatchewan who'd never seen the ocean before they were asked to die on it. It erases the merchant seamen from Nova Scotia who burned to death when their fuel tankers exploded. It erases the deliberate, sovereign decisions of democratic nations that had every legal right to stay neutral and didn't. And nowhere has this erasure been more complete than in the story of the Battle of the Atlantic. Let me tell you what Canada's Navy looked like in September 1939. 6 destroyers. That's it. HMCS Saguenay, Skeena, Fraser, Saint Laurent, Ottawa and Restigouche. Add 5 minesweepers and a handful of auxiliary vessels. Total personnel somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000. The Depression had gutted the Navy's budget. Canada had invested almost nothing in naval infrastructure, shipbuilding capacity, or training facilities. 6 destroyers to fight the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. The battle started the same day Britain declared war, September 3rd, 1939. A German submarine, U-30, torpedoed the passenger liner SS Athenia, west of Ireland. 117 civilians died, including 28 Americans. The killing wouldn't stop for 5 years, 8 months, and 5 days. During that first phase, from September 1939 through the fall of France in June 1940, things were manageable. U-boats operated individually. The convoy system worked reasonably well. The Royal Navy was still the world's largest, and they could cover the routes while Canada built ships and trained crews. Then France fell, and everything changed. German forces controlled the French Atlantic coast now. Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire. U-boats no longer had to transit around the British Isles to reach the convoy lanes. They could sortie directly into the western approaches. What the Germans called the First Happy Time began, July through October 1940, when submarines operating on the surface at night sank Allied shipping with horrifying efficiency. October 1940. 63 ships. Over 350,000 tons. Gone. Canada's response to this crisis was nothing short of an industrial revolution compressed into months instead of decades. Remember, in 1939, Canada had almost no shipbuilding capacity. The Navy had been starved of funding throughout the Depression. There were no assembly lines for warships, no trained workforce, no supply chains for naval-grade steel, propulsion systems, or weapons. The country that would become the world's third largest naval power started with workshops that couldn't build a rowboat to military specification. The solution was the Flower-class corvette. Not because it was the best ship for Atlantic convoy escort, it wasn't, but because it was the ship Canada could actually build. The design was simple enough that civilian shipyards could tool up quickly, small enough that yards along the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence could produce them, rugged enough to survive conditions that would test ships twice their size. Shipyards that had been building freighters, fishing boats and ferries suddenly had naval contracts. Collingwood Shipyards in Ontario, Kingston Shipbuilding, Morton Engineering in Quebec, Marine Industries Limited in Sorel, Davy Shipbuilding in Lausanne, Halifax Shipyards and St. John Dry Dock on the Atlantic coast. Some of these facilities had never built a warship before. Now they were building them by the dozen. The workforce transformation was just as dramatic. Men who knew shipbuilding were already enlisting or working essential war jobs. So the yards started hiring women. By 1943, women made up a significant portion of the shipyard workforce: welders, riveters, electricians. They worked 12-hour shifts in conditions that were dangerous even by wartime standards. Shipyard accidents were common. The pressure to produce was relentless. The Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service, the WRENS, added another dimension to Canada's naval mobilization. Nearly 7,000 women served in the WRCNS by war's end, working as wireless operators, coders, plotters tracking convoy positions, and dozens of other essential roles. They freed men for sea duty, yes, but they also brought skills and discipline that proved indispensable to the shore-based infrastructure that kept the convoys moving. The operations rooms where convoy routes were planned, where U-boat positions were plotted from Huff Duff intercepts, where the vast logistical puzzle of the Atlantic War was managed hour by hour. WRENS staffed many of those positions. And the shipyards delivered. 122 corvettes built in Canadian yards by war's end, plus frigates, minesweepers, patrol vessels and landing craft. The country that couldn't build naval vessels in 1939 was launching new warships every few weeks by 1943. This wasn't just military production. This was a society reorganizing itself around a single purpose. Every corvette that slid down the ways represented thousands of decisions. Steel allocated, workers trained, components sourced, designs modified. A nation that had chosen war was now building the tools to fight it from raw materials and determination. The corvettes weren't elegant ships. They'd been designed for coastal patrol, then pressed into ocean escort duty because Canada could build them fast. Wet, uncomfortable, slow. They rolled through arcs of 40 degrees or more in heavy seas, which was most of the time in the North Atlantic. But tough. They carried depth charges and ASDIC, and they could take a pounding. The Royal Canadian Navy's expansion during 1941 and 1942 was one of the most remarkable organisational achievements of the war. It was also chaotic, desperate, and paid for in blood. Ships were rushed into service with inadequate equipment. Crews were learning their trade in the middle of combat operations. Many Canadian sailors had never seen the ocean before enlisting. Prairie boys from Manitoba and Alberta, farm kids from Saskatchewan. They'd grown up watching wheat fields, and now they were being sent to fight experienced U-boat commanders in conditions that pushed human endurance past anything they'd imagined. The North Atlantic in winter. I want you to picture this. Temperatures well below freezing, ice accumulating on superstructures, threatening to capsize small vessels if crews didn't hack it off constantly with axes and hammers. 40-foot waves in storms. Men on watch soaked by spray that froze on their clothing within seconds. And those corvettes they were sailing, rolling through arcs of 40 degrees or more, not occasionally, constantly. Seasickness wasn't a temporary inconvenience, it was a permanent condition that men simply learned to function through. The watches were 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around the clock. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by action stations' alarms. Meals were whatever the cook could prepare in a galley that tilted and swung with every wave. Hot food was a luxury. Keeping it down was harder. The U-boats had developed the wolf pack tactic by now. Groups of submarines would spread across likely convoy routes, forming patrol lines that convoys couldn't avoid. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it would shadow at a distance and radio the others. The submarine that made contact wouldn't attack immediately. It would track and transmit, vectoring in every other boat within range. Then they'd converge. Usually at night, when ASDIC was less effective and visual detection harder. Multiple directions, simultaneous attacks, overwhelming the escorts. And in the middle of the Atlantic, there was a gap. The Black Pit, some called it. 600 miles of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft from either side. No air cover. U-boats could operate on the surface with impunity. Canadian escorts bore the brunt of defending convoys through this killing zone. The Newfoundland Escort Force, based at St. John's, was established in May 1941 to provide protection through the Western Atlantic. Canadian vessels would escort convoys from Halifax or Sydney, Nova Scotia, to a mid-ocean meeting point where British or American escorts would take over. The basic burden sharing was established early. Canada would protect the Western Atlantic approaches and the mid-ocean gap. This freed Royal Navy resources for the Mediterranean, the Arctic convoys to Russia, home waters defence. And then the war came home. In 1942, German U-boats entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They torpedoed ships within sight of the Quebec shoreline. Canadian civilians watched vessels burning from their front porches. This wasn't some distant ocean battle anymore. This was German submarines operating in Canadian territorial waters, sinking Canadian ships, killing Canadian sailors within miles of Canadian towns. The Battle of the St. Lawrence saw 23 ships sunk between May and October 1942. U-boats prowled waters so close to shore that survivors sometimes swam to Canadian beaches. The ferry SS Caribou, running between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, was torpedoed on October 14, 1942. 137 people died, including women and children. The government tried to keep it quiet. Censorship suppressed news of the sinkings, fearing panic. But word spread anyway. Canadians understood, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't Britain's war that they'd volunteered to help with. This was Canada's war. German submarines were killing people in Canadian waters, and Canadian ships had to stop them. The RCN eventually drove the U-boats out of the St. Lawrence, but not before the campaign had demonstrated something the history books still struggle to acknowledge. Canada wasn't fighting overseas to defend someone else's homeland. By 1942, Canada was defending its own. In September 1942, convoy SC-42 departed Sydney, Nova Scotia, bound for Britain. 64 merchant ships carrying everything a besieged island needed to survive: grain, fuel, manufactured goods, weapons. The escort was Canadian. HMCS Skeena, a destroyer, leading a group of corvettes including Orillia, Alberni and Kenogami. Other escorts would join as the convoy crossed the Atlantic. What happened over the next 4 days would become one of the most brutal convoy battles of the war. Day 1, September 9th. The convoy was south of Greenland when U-85 made contact. The submarine shadowed, transmitted position reports, and waited. More U-boats converged. Eventually, 18 submarines would join the attack on SC-42. That first night, the attacks began. Torpedoes in the darkness, ships erupting in flame. The escorts had ASDIC, but ASDIC was nearly useless against submarines on the surface. And that's how the wolfpacks attacked at night, running on the surface where they were faster than the escorts and invisible to sonar. Day 2, September 10th. The attacks continued through the night and into the dawn. The escort commanders faced impossible choices. Chase a submarine contact and leave a gap in the screen? Hold position and watch U-boats slip through? Every decision cost lives. The corvette's depth charges were almost useless against surfaced submarines. You couldn't depth charge something that wasn't submerged. They tried ramming. They tried illuminating U-boats with searchlights and engaging with deck guns. They fought with whatever they had. Day 3, September 11th. Reinforcements arrived, more escorts, including aircraft, when the convoy finally came within range of Iceland-based planes. But the damage was done. Ship after ship had been torpedoed. Survivors from sunken vessels clung to wreckage in water cold enough to kill in minutes. Rescue ships picked up who they could, but the convoy couldn't stop. Stopping meant death for everyone. Day 4, September 12th. The attacks finally slackened as air cover increased and the Wolfpack withdrew. The convoy limped toward Britain with gaping holes in its formation. Final toll: 15 merchant ships sunk. Thousands of tons of cargo lost. Hundreds of merchant seamen dead or wounded. It was a catastrophic loss rate, and the escort force was largely Canadian. British assessments afterward pointed to inadequate training and equipment. The criticism stung. Canadian crews had fought for 4 continuous days with minimal sleep, watching ships burn around them, knowing their weapons were barely adequate for the threat they faced. But the assessments also obscured a structural problem that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The Royal Canadian Navy was stretched far beyond its capacity. Operating more convoy miles per ship than the Royal Navy, receiving fewer resources, less sophisticated equipment, newer, greener crews trained in months instead of years. Canada was carrying more than its share, and getting blamed when that impossible load proved too heavy. Now I need to talk about the merchant seamen, because this is where the historical record gets morally obscene. The British Merchant Navy alone suffered 30,248 deaths during the Second World War, roughly 1 in 4 of all British merchant seamen who served. That's a higher casualty rate than any of Britain's armed services. The Canadian Merchant Navy lost approximately 1,600 men from a much smaller force. Add in American, Norwegian, Dutch, Greek and other Allied merchant navies, and the total climbs far higher. Some estimates place combined Allied merchant losses at over 36,000 dead. These were civilians, not enlisted military personnel. They could, in theory, refuse to sail, though doing so would cost them their livelihood and possibly their freedom under wartime regulations. Most of them sailed anyway, voyage after voyage, sometimes surviving one torpedoing only to sign on for another ship and risk it again. The manner of their deaths was rarely quick. When a torpedo struck a merchant ship, usually without warning, usually at night, the explosion was just the beginning. Ships carrying fuel oil or gasoline could erupt in flames that spread across the water's surface. Men who survived the initial blast and made it overboard found themselves swimming through fire. The fuel burned on top of the waves. There was nowhere to go. Ships carrying iron ore or other dense cargo could sink in 2 or 3 minutes. No time to launch lifeboats, no time for distress signals. One moment you're in your bunk or standing watch, the next the deck is vertical and the water is rushing in. Even those who made it into lifeboats faced the Atlantic itself. Water temperature in the North Atlantic during winter hovers around 4 degrees Celsius. That's 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Immersion in water that cold produces hypothermia within minutes. Unconsciousness follows quickly. Death comes before rescue can arrive, unless rescue is very close and very fast. Those who made it into lifeboats and stayed dry had better odds, but not good odds. Lifeboats drifted for days, sometimes weeks. Exposure, dehydration, injuries from the sinking, infections from burns, all of these killed men who had survived the torpedo. Some lifeboats were never found at all. They drifted until everyone aboard was dead, then drifted some more until the Atlantic claimed them entirely. Between 1939 and 1945, the Allies lost roughly 3,500 merchant ships in the Atlantic campaign. The U-boat force paid its own price. About 28,000 of 40,000 German submariners died, a casualty rate exceeding 70%. Both sides suffered horribly. But here's the difference nobody wants to say out loud. The merchant seamen were trying to deliver food. The U-boats were trying to starve a civilian population into submission. Both groups suffered. Only one was engaged in a crime against humanity. And documentary after documentary will spend minutes humanizing U-boat crews while giving merchant seamen deaths a single sentence. Maybe a number flashed on screen. Maybe nothing at all. Tens of thousands of dead civilians, erased. Before I explain how the Allies finally broke the wolf packs, I need to explain the technology that made both the problem and the solution possible. Because this was a war of detection and counter-detection, measure and countermeasure, and understanding the mechanics matters. ASDIC, what the Americans called sonar, was the primary tool for finding submerged submarines. The principle is simple enough. You transmit a pulse of sound into the water, and you listen for echoes bouncing back from solid objects. A submarine has a distinctive echo. Once you detected that echo, you could estimate range and bearing, then attack with depth charges. The problem was the geometry. The ASDIC transducer mounted beneath the escort ship's hull and projected sound forward and downward in a cone-shaped beam. Think of it like a flashlight beam, but made of sound. As you closed on a submarine contact, you were always looking ahead and down. At some point, the submarine would pass beneath your beam. You'd lose contact precisely when you most needed it, during the final attack run. This created a blind time of 30 seconds or more. Doesn't sound like much, but a submarine at depth, moving at even modest speed, could travel a considerable distance in 30 seconds. The U-boat captain knew the escort was blind. He would use those seconds to maneuver, turn hard, change depth, do anything to be somewhere other than where the depth charges were falling. The result was depth charges had an abysmal success rate. Various estimates put it around 1.65%. You fired your weapon into a space where you thought the submarine might be, based on where it was 30 seconds ago. Usually, you were wrong. HFDUF, high-frequency direction finding, attacked the problem from a different angle. The Wolfpack tactic required radio communication. The submarine that spotted a convoy had to transmit its position so others could converge. HFDUF receivers installed on escort ships could detect these transmissions and determine their bearing. Multiple ships with HFDUF could triangulate a transmitting submarine's position. This turned the Wolfpack's greatest strength into a vulnerability. The more they coordinated, the more they transmitted. The more they transmitted, the more they revealed their positions. Escorts could vector toward transmitting U-boats before the pack finished assembling. March 1943 brought the Battle of the Atlantic to its crisis point. Convoy SC-122 departed New York on March 5th. The faster HX-229 followed 3 days later. 40 U-boats attacked both convoys in a running battle from March 16th to March 20th. 22 merchant ships sunk. Over 146,000 tons of shipping and cargo sent to the bottom. Allied shipping losses for the month exceeded 500,000 tons. At this rate, the mathematical models both sides used to project the war's outcome began to favour Germany. More ships were being sunk than could be built. Britain's supplies of food and fuel were declining week by week. The invasion of Europe looked increasingly impossible. The crisis demanded innovation. And this is where I need to talk about Captain Frederick John Walker of the Royal Navy. Walker wasn't Canadian. This is a video about Canada's contribution, and I'm not going to pretend a British officer was secretly from Manitoba. But tactical innovation doesn't respect national boundaries, and what Walker developed would save Canadian lives and get adopted by Canadian escorts within months. Walker's problem was that ASDIC blind spot I described earlier. Lose contact in the final seconds and you're guessing. Walker's solution was elegant. Don't lose contact. The creeping attack used 2 ships working in concert. The directing ship would hang back at a distance where it could maintain continuous ASDIC contact with the submarine. It would never close to attack range, so it would never lose the target in its beam's dead zone. The attacking ship would approach at dead slow speed, creeping, to minimize its own noise and water disturbance. The directing ship would talk the attacker onto the target by radio, providing bearing and range corrections right up until the moment of attack. Come left 2 degrees, target range 400 yards. Steady. Target range 300 yards. Come right 1 degree. Target range 200 yards. Stand by. Target range 100 yards. Fire. No blind spot, no guesswork. The U-boat couldn't hide. Walker commanded the 36th Escort Group and later the legendary 2nd Support Group, built around his flagship HMS Starling. Support groups were themselves a tactical innovation. Fast, well-trained hunter-killer units that could reinforce convoys under attack or pursue contacts that regular escorts couldn't chase without abandoning their charges. Walker's 2nd Support Group accounted for approximately 20 U-boats. During one patrol in early 1944, they sank 6 submarines in a single trip. Walker was awarded the Distinguished Service Order 4 times, virtually unprecedented. He pushed himself beyond human limits. Died of a cerebral thrombosis in July 1944, almost certainly from exhaustion. He was 48 years old. The creeping attack spread throughout Allied escort forces. Canadian groups adopted and refined these tactics, and they got results. In March 1944, the Canadian C-2 Escort Group, working alongside British vessels, hunted U-744 for over 30 hours in one of the longest sustained anti-submarine actions of the war. The corvettes HMCS Chilliwack and HMCS Fennel were in on the kill, along with other escorts. 32 hours of tracking, attacking, and refusing to let the submarine escape. The U-boat finally surfaced, its crew surrendering. Canadian persistence, Canadian tactics, Canadian victory. May 1943. Everything came together. The Allies sank 41 U-boats that month, more than any previous month of the war. German submariners called it Black May. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat force, was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes on May 24th. The crisis was over. But Black May wasn't the achievement of one man or one navy. British radar, American aircraft, Canadian escorts, cryptographic intelligence from Bletchley Park, Norwegian merchant shipping, South African protection of the Cape route where convoys had to go when the Mediterranean was too dangerous, Indian naval expansion protecting supply lines through the Persian Gulf. The whole was vastly greater than any nation's individual contribution. The Royal Indian Navy had expanded from roughly 1,800 men at war's outbreak to a force capable of protecting convoy routes across the Indian Ocean. Ships like HMIS Sutlej became some of the most active convoy escorts in their theatre, guarding supply lines to the Middle East and the supplies flowing to the Soviet Union through Iran. South African naval forces protected the Cape route that kept the long way around supply lines open when the Mediterranean was contested. And in April 1943, the organisational recognition of Canada's contribution finally came. The Canadian Northwest Atlantic Command was established with Rear Admiral Leonard W. Murray as Commander-in-Chief. Murray became the only Canadian to command a theatre of war during the Second World War. His area of responsibility covered the western portion of the North Atlantic convoy routes, where convoys formed up, where they were most vulnerable during departure and arrival, where the mid-ocean gap had made life most dangerous before air cover closed it. The only Canadian to command a theatre of war. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't a supporting role. This wasn't helping out. A Canadian officer was given operational command of one of the most critical battle spaces of the entire conflict. The war didn't end in May 1943. U-boats would return, equipped with snorkels that let them run diesel engines while submerged, staying hidden longer but paying for it in speed and manoeuvrability. Ships would still be sunk until the last day of the war, and in those final years, one Canadian ship would earn a reputation that still echoes. HMCS Haida. A tribal-class destroyer commissioned in 1943, she would become the most decorated ship in the Royal Canadian Navy's history, and arguably the most aggressive surface combatant Canada ever put to sea. Haida didn't just escort convoys, she hunted. She sank German destroyers in running night battles in the English Channel. She engaged E-boats. She rescued survivors from HMCS Athabaskan when her sister ship was torpedoed in April 1944. By war's end, Haida had sunk more enemy surface tonnage than any other Canadian warship. She was the sharp end of a navy that had transformed from 6 obsolete destroyers into a force that could go toe-to-toe with the Kriegsmarine and win. The convoys kept coming. The escorts kept protecting them. The supplies got through. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Royal Canadian Navy had grown from those 6 destroyers to become the 3rd largest navy in the world. 3rd largest in the world, behind only the United States and Britain. Over 370 vessels, destroyers, frigates, corvettes, minesweepers, motor torpedo boats, support ships. From practically nothing to a global naval power in 6 years. 122 corvettes built in Canadian shipyards. Peak personnel over 100,000 sailors. The Newfoundland Escort Force, the Mid-Ocean Escort Force, the Canadian Northwest Atlantic Command. Rear Admiral Murray, HMCS Haida, HMCS Skeena. Names that should be in every documentary about the Battle of the Atlantic, and almost never are. None of this gets mentioned. Decade after decade, documentary after documentary, the same Anglo-centric myth gets repeated. Britain stood alone. Britain endured. Britain prevailed. Britain had help. Massive, organised, sovereign help from nations that chose to fight and built their military capacity from almost nothing, while simultaneously bleeding for the cause. So the next time you hear someone say, Britain stood alone, in a documentary, in a comment section, in a conversation, you now have the facts to correct them. September 3rd, 1939. Australia and New Zealand declared war the same day Britain did. September 6th, 1939. South Africa declared war after a genuine parliamentary battle, 80 to 67. September 10th, 1939. Canada declared war after a deliberate week-long pause, making absolutely clear this was a sovereign choice. By 1942, U-boats were sinking ships in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Canada was defending its own waters, not just someone else's. By 1945, the Royal Canadian Navy was the third largest in the world. Canadian escorts carried the heaviest convoy load in the North Atlantic. A Canadian admiral commanded a theatre of war. HMCS Hyder had become the most decorated warship in Canadian history. Tens of thousands of merchant seamen, British, Canadian, Norwegian, American, Dutch, Greek, had died keeping Britain fed. And most of them have been forgotten by the same documentaries that spend minutes on U-boat specifications. This isn't about taking credit away from Britain. The Royal Navy fought brilliantly. Captain Walker's innovations saved countless lives. British cryptographers at Bletchley Park provided intelligence that let convoys dodge wolf packs. But it was never Britain alone. It was never just the Royal Navy. And every time that myth gets repeated, it erases the deliberate choices of millions of people who voted to fight fascism when they could have stayed neutral. Canada chose. Australia chose. New Zealand chose. South Africa chose, barely after a fight, but they chose. For the Canadians who've been screaming this in comment sections for years, this one's for you. You were right. You've always been right. And for everyone else, now you know. Subscribe for more stories like this.